Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. As Tim said, I'm Adam Cooper. I'm the Policy and Engagement Director at the National Infrastructure Commission, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Infrastructure Assessment that we're currently undertaking. I put this slide up at a lot of my presentations, and it shows the infrastructure challenge in terms of supply of infrastructure and investment in infrastructure, and you can see that for the last 30-40 years we've had fairly low levels of infrastructure investment. We've become very good as a country at squeezing the most out of our infrastructure, and we have some of the most productive infrastructure in the world, but I think in terms of a big long cycle, it's now time that, and I think governments have recognised this, that we need to start investing in infrastructure again, and we've seen some fairly large announcements in the last 6 to 12 months around Heathrow, Hinckley, High Speed 2, and so on. But the challenge is really, are we making sure we're making the most out of these large items of expenditure, and are we able to spend our infrastructure pounds wisely? We've come to a similar conclusion to the NNA, and in fact have taken a lot of the figures from the NNA about the increase in demand for infrastructure. I think it's worth pointing out as well that not only are we going to have more people in the country, they're also going to tend to live more in cities, and that presents particular infrastructure challenges in terms of getting people around and also making sure they have power and water and their waste is taken away. So one of our challenges in looking at infrastructure on a national basis is it's as much about how to meet and manage demand as it is about increasing the supply of infrastructure. So if you talk to a lot of people about infrastructure, the criticisms that are levelled are that it tends to be fraught by short-term thinking. It tends to be somewhat siloed. The government departments for water, for energy, for transport are all separate departments, and it's not always easy, despite the best efforts of officials, to join up and work across departments. Infrastructure can be contentious and might not always have local approval for schemes of national importance, and at the bottom, unpredictable. The lack of clear long-term policy frameworks can cause uncertainty for investors and make it difficult to fund and finance our infrastructure. So part of the reason the NIC was set up was to be an independent body, independent of government, to take a long-term view and take a cross-sectoral view and maybe look a little more objectively and technocratically than the politicians would maybe like us to. The keystone of our work, we do some work into in-depth studies. We've already done some into transport in the north. We've done a study on Crossrail 2 in London. We've done one into the flexibility in the electricity system over the next 10 to 15 years. And just before Christmas, we published a report into 5G mobile technology and what the UK needs to do to be a world leader in this area. But our key piece of work, and probably occupies kind of 2/3 to 3/4 of the staff at the NIC, is the National Infrastructure Assessment. And we'll do this once a Parliament. So we started late on this Parliament because we weren't set up until the end of 2015. And we cover the key sectors similar to the NNA. We cover we cover transport, energy, digital, water, waste and flooding. We don't have a direct remit on housing, but we look very carefully at the interaction between infrastructure and housing. I think unlike a lot of bodies, we take a very long-term view, so we're less concerned with the projects that are kind of shovel-ready and getting them built, but we're taking a kind of 10 to 30-year time horizon. This means that a lot of the kind of the churn and today's concerns really, we try and look beyond, and we try and think about, well, what's going to happen to 2050? What are going to be the key trends? And government policy tends to be kind of fairly transient when you look over that time horizon. We will make recommendations in our National Infrastructure Assessment to the government, and the way we're set up as an independent body, the government is obliged to respond to those recommendations. It's not obliged to agree with us. Where it does agree with us, our recommendations become government policy. Where it doesn't agree with us, the government will say why. And a major part of our remit is to hold government to account on this, because the strongest power we have is to make recommendations. We need to make sure that government is acting on those recommendations as well. So on something like Crossrail 2, when we recommended that the government take it forward, if the government isn't going to be taking it forward, then they will hear very publicly from us that they're not taking our recommendations forward. And again, as I said, We're about taking a long-term view and putting our government decisions in a long-term context. But we also look at infrastructure as a system of systems. So we're looking at the interaction between infrastructure systems, not just in silos, and also the way that infrastructure and the services that infrastructure provides supports economic growth and competitiveness and the quality of life in Britain. So by being able, again, to take that slightly higher level view and look at the interaction between the sectors, we're perhaps able to avoid some of the siloed thinking of the past. We're determined to be transparent, which we're again able to do, not being so constrained by ministerial priorities, and also based on a robust methodology and evidence. We've picked up quite a lot of the stuff. We're piggybacking on some of the stuff that the NNA has done. We're also using the ITRC. We're using a lot of the infrastructure models, both from government departments and universities, to be able to come up with scenarios for demand for infrastructure out to 2050. And we've just finished a call for evidence. So we've one of the great things about being a new organisation is you start with literally with a blank sheet of paper, and you start with no evidence base. So we've just had a 4-month call for evidence where we've had a lot of stuff in from a lot of organisations, from the private sector, from academics, and from government departments, which will help us analyse and make recommendations on infrastructure. So we don't just have a blank checkbook either. We don't have any money, but we don't have a blank checkbook for our recommendations either. We have to operate within a fiscal envelope, and that was set at the autumn statement last year at 1.2% of GDP for publicly funded, central government funded projects, so largely transport projects. We also have to have regard to the bill payer when we're looking at privately funded infrastructure. 1.2% is more than we've spent historically at a central government level. It's still maybe not as much as other countries, but it's definitely an improvement. But once you take some of the large projects that government's committed to, such as High Speed 2, and if you take things like Crossrail 2 out of it as well, that doesn't leave a huge amount of wiggle room. But I think that's less of an issue for us, because we don't see ourselves just as a body that dreams up mega projects and recommends that government goes ahead with mega projects. It's a lot more about the enabling the decisions, and a lot of that can be about governance and decision making. So where we're going to make the most value and make a bigger splash, I think, is not in the individual sectors. We've got a lot of august bodies that look at the future of transport or the future of energy and so on. And we don't want to be another voice in the crowd there. Where we're going to add value is really some of the cross-cutting areas. So although we're a National Infrastructure Commission, we're going to look at local growth and how you can grow different regions of the UK. It's not just all about the London and the South East. We're looking at funding and financing. It's fascinating to see the difference in infrastructure funding from big public transport works, which are funded by central government, all the way through to digital, which, as Andrew said, is almost entirely funded by the private sector. So we see some real value in looking at a comparison of these models and seeing whether we can attract more capital and better value capital into the infrastructure sector. We're looking at resilience of our infrastructure. We're in particular taking into account of some of the lack of resilience shown in recent floods. So when a bridge goes down as a result of flooding, if you've got your electricity cables and your telecoms cables, you don't just lose the bridge and the road transport, you also lose other sectors as well. So we're looking carefully at resilience and also sustainability in the environment. Our objective is around sustainable economic growth. And one of the things that we do count as a given in our approach and our assumptions is that the government will continue to work towards its carbon targets. We're also looking very carefully at green infrastructure and the contribution that can make towards providing sustainable infrastructure as our country becomes richer and more populous. Governance and decision making, again, one of the big levers we can have is by making recommendations on how to plan and make decisions on infrastructure better, and you can expect to see quite a lot of that in our report. And we're also going to look carefully at the current government evaluation and performance methodologies on infrastructure to check whether those are fit for purpose, and also some of the performance measures of infrastructure, so we can set a baseline and understand that the infrastructure is doing the things that we want it to do. We have a variety of approaches. We're doing a lot of stakeholder engagement. We've had a number of visits to each of the regions of the UK, and we've engaged experts from different sectors on subjects such as when are we going to reach peak car, what's going to be the effect on the environment of the infrastructure choices we make in the next 30 years, and we're doing one on autonomous vehicles in a couple of months. We're doing a lot of scenario building and modelling, and I'll talk about some of the drivers of those that we've put papers out for. We're doing some social research. We've just finished some qualitative research in 3 different locations in the UK, and we're using that to form some quantitative surveys that we will then publish alongside our interim document this summer. We've got expert panels that we engage with, and we're also looking at international best practice. We're doing a little bit of new analysis in this one. Because our timetable's fairly compressed, we've got a kind of 18 months to do this infrastructure assessment. We're not doing as much new analysis as we'd like. Hopefully once we have delivered this infrastructure assessment in 2018, we will start on the next one, like painting the Forth Bridge, which will then come hopefully slightly earlier in the Parliament, probably 2021-22, and that will give us an opportunity to really spend some time to commission or carry out some new analysis into infrastructure. So next steps, our call for evidence has just closed. If any of you who've worked for organisations who've submitted evidence, well, thank you very much. We've published 3 discussion papers, and we've got a 4th coming on the drivers of infrastructure demand and supply. We published one just before Christmas on technology and the effect technology will have on infrastructure demand, one on population growth just after Christmas, and then one on the economy that we published this week, showing how economic growth, the elasticities between income growth and demand for infrastructure services. We got a 4th paper which will be on the effects of the environment and climate change on infrastructure. We're going to publish what we're calling our vision and priorities document, which is effectively an interim report of the National Infrastructure Assessment. That will happen in the summer. We'll set out our vision for infrastructure to 2050 and some of the key priorities in the areas that we're going to focus in on. We then expect to have a fairly long period of consultation and engagement. Again, as a new organisation undertaking a fairly new area, we think we're fairly unique in terms of our scope, our independence and the time horizon that we operate on. So we want to get as much feedback and engagement from people as possible. So there'll be a long period of engagement in the autumn where we test some of the ideas we've come out with in our interim report. And then we're looking in the first half of next year to produce the final National Infrastructure Assessment, which will have a raft of recommendations for government, which we will then make sure and hold them to account that they will continue to operate on.